Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our Sunday afternoon reading at American Poetry Museum. We are being joined today by Miho Kinnas, who's a writer and poetry translator. Her most recent book of poems is Move Over Bird, published by Math Paper Press. She's joining us from Hilton Head in South Carolina. And known as the cultural ambassador of Washington, D.C., Ethelbert Miller, who will be reading with Miho, is the author of several books of poetry, most recently of How I Found Love Behind the Catcher's Mitt, published by City Point Press. Thank you so much for joining us on Sunday and sharing part of your weekend with us, Ethelbert and Miho. I wanted to start about asking you about this collaboration that you've both been having as poets, which I think is a very unique way to create poetry. You're not just collaborating on a poetry project, you're co-authoring poems together. Can we start by talking a little bit about that and how you came up with the idea, what your process is, and exactly how you do it?
Miho?
Okay, so in the world of haiku writing, collaboration, a linked poem is a kind of tradition. So I have done collaborative writing with haiku poets as haiku, linked haiku. But what we're doing here is a little bit different. We were just chatting and started to exchanging lines. And he had something on his mind. I was thinking about something else. But as we keep going down, you know, we start working really together. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that, you know, collaboration is very important for any artist in terms of their own growth and development. You know, right now I'm collaborating with the Visual Artists Competitive Club, and I'm learning a lot from that in terms of dealing with a visual artist. In terms of Miho, it's been very interesting because she's also a translator. And so what happens is that you're very much aware of language. You're very much aware in terms of how you're interacting. As she said, this came out of our correspondence. And I think this has a lot to do with how the technology has affected our writing. You know, we're able to write almost in real time, as opposed to, you know, corresponding and having the post office wait for us to get the next letter. So I think that's a, yeah, and I would say the only thing similar to this that I'm doing with Miho probably occurred with Liz Alexander many years ago, where, you know, when you did the email, you had a signature, you know, at the end. And I used to say, I love you more than, you know, Beard and Love, you know, collage. And that got into a thing where Elizabeth was saying, I love you more than such and such, back and forth. And then I turned all of that, those lines, into a poem called Divine Love, you know, which was just signatures that I had added. But that was a form of collaboration. And then I would just end, the only other writer I collaborated with in terms of actually writing the same poem was the poet Wanda Coleman. We wrote a poem together.
So this process for the both of you started organically from emails back and forth.
You sound like we're vegetables.
And how did it progress from there? I mean, so for me, it speaks to your bond and friendship that, you know I don't share lines of poetry with just anyone, especially as I'm creating them off the cuff like that. So it grew out of this friendship. From that, how did you take it to the next step of saying, hey, we've got a poem together, or let's write a poem together?
Miho?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I don't think there's any clear-cut point, you know, we decided to do this, but I guess that we met as poets. So the poetry is always between us, you know, that's what we are doing together. And that's what each of us spend most of our time in our life anyway. So it was kind of natural. I don't even call it progression. It's just a next step. Yes.
And does it strictly happen by email, or are you collaborating by phone, on Zoom? How?
You know, it's almost all email. It's almost all email.
Wow, that's
And
amazing.
it's also very quick. I think that we did these poems very quick.
Mhm.
You know, it wasn't like, you know, she sent me a line, I had to think about it for 2 days, and then like the next line, I don't think it was like that.
Very interesting. Well, let's start by sharing some poems. Miho, you're gonna share 2 poems first, and the first one is a collaborative piece that the 2 of you
That's
wrote,
right.
correct?
Yes.
We'll see if we can tell the difference. Thank you, Miho.
Okay, so yeah, this was the 3rd poem we wrote together. The sound of silk at night. How do we separate words from red plum blossoms? Why is the kitchen counter wet? The white blossoms reflect the moonlight for her to read the letter. The sweet aroma of tea swirls up from the cup. Her open envelope is pushed aside. Plum trees bear words. They pluck the fruit from the orchard by night. In starlight, the buttons on her blouse tinges as soft words fall. The sound of silk startles a creature in the trees, a voice in the wind. Since water jumps over rocks, frogs leap.
Thank you, Miho. When I first read this poem, the closing stanza, the first thing I thought of was a haiku. And now I see the source of that. Share with us one of your own poems.
Okay. I think I'm going to read another night poem. It's called Into the Night. I live on the island, so wherever I go, I have to cross at least one bridge. Into the night. The building shades the blinding sun, but I keep my sunglasses on. Gritty particles fill the air. Why are you so beautiful? As if you don't want me to be. Days filter through like a little fish between my fingers, but a lifetime is still a long time. The sky is deeper, and the fire pit spells out the question. How can I blame you when I am indigo drunk? Crossing the dark bridges over the intracoastal, I turn the headlights off. Nobody sees my untied hair gone wild.
Thank you. One of the things I observed in your poems, which I also seem to surface in your collaboration poems, is these juxtapositions, these contrasts, opposites coming together. Can you talk a little bit about how you make those choices between these seeming opposites? Sometimes they're not opposite, they're just such distinctly different details.
Well, I often do not notice that they are opposite or, it's out of order. I am pretty much writing what I am seeing. But sometimes in the process of edit, I find some better word comes to me. And then I start to switch in the words. And then sometimes that turns out to be, that's something that means something opposite. But somehow I find that right. But it's hard to explain.
So
well, one thing that I find you did explain to me at one time, Miho, which I found interesting in your work, is that sometimes whatever was happening around you, or what you were doing, you would bring into the poem. And so in that sense, it's interesting in terms of how Naomi phrased her question. This is juxtaposition, but it just happens to be what is happening around you, what you're hearing, what you're seeing.
Well, I was told the other day that I write absolutely about anything. So, which is right. Yes, I do write about anything. So
I got
yes.
Mm. Thank you so much. Ethelbert, can we hear a couple of poems from you?
Sure, I'll also read a poem that Miho and I collaborate on. It's called Books. Are there books on other planets? I will take a book by you when I go home. There are no bookshelves inside words. Only your heart has 7 chapters. My fingers tried to memorize each page. You have a habit of bending corners. I also underline beautiful things when I read. Writings in the margin are fading rapidly, however. I no longer hear you gently tracing my side.
That's beautiful.
You know, and as I mentioned to Miho, the first line, which is the one I sort of started the poem with, and then she responded to, are there books on other planets? And I feel that was a line that came to me because, the last few weeks, actually last few years, we've really been dealing with this whole thing of censorship. This whole thing of what young people should be reading in their schools and their classrooms, parent groups taking books off the shelves of school library. So that's where I say, okay, this is happening. What's happening on the other planets? So that's where it began. So you can see in terms of one, I'm thinking of what's going on, but I think that once I began to collaborate with Miho, you can see that she takes it in another direction, so that by the end of this poem, it's almost as if the book itself is speaking. I no longer hear you gently tracing my side.
Thank you. And it's so seamless. I wouldn't have guessed that there were 2 voices in this poem. It makes me think one of my favorite American poets, who's known really as a children's poet, is Paul Fleischman, who wrote the book Poems for 2 Voices. Do you know it? So you get 2 voices simultaneously, either down and across. It's his work is absolutely stunning. The foundation of it are the 2 distinct voices, as in a conversation going back and forth. So that becomes part of the work itself. Then, there are exchanges. Whereas if this is a seamless poem, and you can't guess that there are 2 authors.
There's also the concept, I go back to people like Buckminster Fuller, there's also the concept of synergy taking place, where you're building something that's going to be much stronger, okay, there's integral parts, but when you bring them together, they build something completely different that's much stronger. So that synergy, I think, is very important too.
Actually, you might find it interesting. When I got this first line, other planets, I was thinking alien. Oh, I think I'm going to go to the Mars. So I became the alien. So we were thinking about totally different things. I was cleaning my desk when I received this line. So it's quite interesting.
And the world makes you feel that a lot sometimes lately. I wish you could be in another planet, at least for the day or part of an afternoon. Thank you. Ethelbert, will we hear a second poem?
Well, it's almost in your last comment where we're dealing with the world. And so this is a poem, the last poem I've written, actually, wrote it last past week, a poem written on Ash Wednesday for the people of Ukraine. You already know what war looks like. So when you hear the bombs, smell the smoke, feel the fear or touch death in the air, you know and recognize hell for the war it is. No need to turn around. No, not now. How do we survive our burning hearts and this unleashed hell of hatred from afar? Peace now crushed to ashes, along with every wooden cross and every piece of broken palm. We suffer, not just to survive. We survive to live and love again. Yes, there is a heaven above, and yes, to this heaven we rise, not once, but once again.
Thank you. As I'm sure both of you probably have, I found it very difficult to think about anything else but the Ukraine recently, and it moved me so much. I also was very interested in how seemed to be a poem, it pivoted on a Christian holiday, right? Where you express repentance and for your sins and devotion to your God. But the end, to me, even though it talks about heaven, it seems very cyclical, like a karmic cycle, and as if the author is taking refuge in the karmic cycle of like, we'll be here to begin again. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Well, what happens, I mean, I use religion quite a bit, in terms of when we deal with Ash Wednesday, when we deal with them putting the cross on here, this is the beginning of Lent. You're carrying that cross, okay? This works well in terms of peace now crushed to ashes along, because you get the ashes from the palm, so what happens is that it's very strong in terms of the references and the whole thing, the cross that we carry. The only thing I had to wrestle with in terms of the sound of the poem, the ending of the poem sounded a little too much like Maya Angelou, Still I Rise. And so what happens, that's why I have this repetition, yes, to this heaven we rise, and not once, but once again. So that I end with the word again and not end on the word rise. Like, right, the line before the last line is rise. I didn't want to end on that, because like Still I Rise, that sounds like Maya Angelou. And so you have to be aware of these poems, especially when you're writing a political poem, because there's an urgency behind it. And it's the type of poem sometimes that just has immediacy of now. But that's why I say, okay, a poem written on Ash Wednesday. And you could go from now, any time this Ash Wednesday, I could read this poem, and it's probably going to be some conflict going on. Before Ukraine, I was dealing with Ethiopia and Eritrea. That was the war I was following, and then it's just seeing that because of the news, it shifted. Before that, I was dealing with January 6th, in terms of if the country's still going to be here, So all of these things I think are very important. And I think with Miho as well, my own work, there is a sort of spiritual quality that's there. And some of it is paying attention to nature. Some of it is saying, you could probably go look at Miho's work and say, okay, there's a metaphor for birds. There's a metaphor when she's talking about water. And so those are the things that we as writers, we use that language in those terms because they're universal and they speak to everyone.
I'm lucky I get to be a reader who gets to ask a question, because it's that very Still I Rise Again line that kind of made me think about the karmic cycle and what comes before it. Because, okay, so we get to fight, and I think of this fighting, like the whole thing impacted me, triggered me about Ukraine in a very personal way, unlike anything had recently, from like a colonized daughter's perspective. Here's the colonizer again. There will always be a colonizer. Why would there be a colonizer? And so bringing a spiritual perspective of that, a wider perspective, I guess has been especially important to me this past few days, this past week. So, and it's so in my mind, and maybe it's me as a reader making meaning, I was haunted by the idea, we get to suffer and fight and overcome to live again. And so just to live again. And so there seems to be something so profound and also beautiful about that, like the reward for, the cycle of life and death and suffering and overcoming and fighting.
And that's why it's important. That's
which may be just it.
Well, and that's what would get you through Lent. Okay, so it's a period of Lent. I mean, that is a whole thing where you are being challenged. Okay, if you survive that, yes, then you can rise on at the end. But Lent is a key thing, and Ash Wednesday is the beginning of that. And so that should not be overlooked or forgotten.
Thank you, E. Miho, can we hear from you again?
Okay. So the next two poems are Inside a Day poem, Inside a Way, and also Inside Myself. So it's not up-to-date news items, or it's not a political poem. But it's kind of interesting how those things manifest in different poems. Okay, pulse. The rumor of mystery bird is whispered in the waiting room. Listen for a long fermata in a bird song. An X-ray photo of my number 14 tooth is clipped onto the board. Back home, the telephone rings once. By the window, berries dangle, some prophecy in codes. Mailman delivers a thick envelope to a wrong address. The outdoor concert tunes arrive part by part. I smooth the pleats of the beige curtain. A cold snap has left the second blooming stranded. My heart begins to syncopate against the top of the drumbeat. In an alley, widower's flashlight swings over his dog. The pushpins leave holes on the map. The cul-de-sac house, one window is lit. Fog is forecast after the late night rain.
Thank you. Thank you.
Backyard. The screen porch collects a thick layer of dust. The backyard is a battlefield for songbirds. Two of my friends are looking for used fire hose. I tidy and clean the house between reading chapters of The Door, a Hungarian novel about a woman writer and her enigmatic help. I scrape the edge of the tiles with the bricklayer's trowel. It is time to call my mother. What wishes should I make with a single coin? She picks up the phone on the second ring. She doesn't remember she broke her bones over the winter. Will someone play Schumann's Arabesque, Opus 18? As I doodle, I cannot remember where I left the amulet. Moss doesn't grow on the chipped wrist of Uppsala statuette. I shoot a crow of my bird feeder. The rain is as soft as a marsh bunny.
Thank you, thank you. In these two poems in particular, for me, I see the genius of your precise details. Those almost the opposites and seemingly opposites that play back and forth in this delicate dance, but it's the precise details of this, like our lived experience, how we take in, oh, this is what's happening in my environment, this is what I'm thinking, and this is what I'm feeling. The details of the precise details of our perceptions that make up our life. And when one reads your poems on the page, they just flow like little prose poems, exceedingly so if one looks at the form of these two particular poems. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about form for you. How do you choose a container? How does that happen for you? Is it completely organic, or is there some forethought about this?
I think I heavily depend on forms of some sort. So form can be also, it's a process. So the process I used to write this poem is I write one line every hour of the same day. So I begin like 5 a.m., 6 a.m. I wake up early, one line, I concentrate and then write one line. And so you do that for 14 hours a day. And if you keep doing this for about 2 weeks or so in a row, you really get used to it. And not all of them are good, but because I'm writing in one day and every hour I'm writing, so there is something connected. from line to line. I'm in this, maybe in a way, the same state of mind. So that's a form.
Stunning. And this is how your form comes about. So it's dictated by you revisiting the poem in one line units. That's incredible. It reminds me, it's something about it feels very, very strongly to me like a Zen practice. If I'm doing an at-home retreat for one day, I will meditate every hour, hour and a half. I will come back and stop what I'm doing. I can do whatever I want, but I come back and sit. And it may be 15 minutes, it may be a half hour. And it's as if with every return to the cushion, I shed something else, or something surfaces that I haven't been dealing with that I need to address. And so it reminds me of that rhythm. I've never heard of anyone doing this. It's sort of like a devotion to the poem and to poetry in general. I am definitely going to try this. That's beautiful.
Anyone can try this, yes, and it's worth trying.
Wow. And so this is what you do with poems in general? Is this how you write all poems, or is this how you wrote these two poems in particular?
Well, I do decide, I'm going to do this today, I'm going to do this tomorrow. Yes. So, but some of the lines, I can, it's a beginning of something else. So it's almost like writing a journal or diary. Then you revisit later on and something else begins. So not necessarily, this is the only way I write, no, but this is one way that I find it very useful for me.
So I'm imagining that then, the page is like a canvas and you may come back and like reshuffle, shift around, end up with two pieces, depending upon what you're looking at. That's fabulous. I am going to try that. I'm sure that people who are listening might want to ask a follow-up question, such as, what do you do? Do you set an alarm? And how do you choose the day that you're going to do this for 14 hours?
So the first time I did it, I learned this technique from a teacher, Barbara Hennings, and she published a book of prompt recently, but it's in it too. But people use them differently. The form is given to us, but we can do as we find it fit to our own life. So I do not set the alarm or anything, but I am very aware that day. So it's maybe the last line was 45 minutes ago, not 60 minutes ago. But, I'm very aware all day long when I'm doing it, and I do when I can. Yes.
Wow. Thank you. I'm so glad I asked this question. So grateful for that. Ethelbert, can we hear a couple of poems from you next?
Okay, this is the counter. I'm standing next to my mother at the counter, my head below the counter. I'm small. There are some things I cannot see, but I see my mother hand a man money for the things we need. The man does not place the change in my mother's outstretched palm. He slams it down on the counter. My mother sweeps the coins into her hands. She turns and yanks me away from the counter. I can feel the anger in my mother's hand. It creeps into my fingers. Outside the store, I feel the power of my mother's black hand. It comforts me. It guides me. There is no street I cannot cross. And I'll say a little bit about this poem. This is the thing I very much aware this growing up. In the Bronx, you go to a store and sometimes the cashier would not want to touch a person of color's hand, so the money was put on the counter. If the person was very rude and didn't really want to serve you, they would just throw the coins at you. And keep in mind, this is being done to like your mother, so it's not like a child-to-child type of relationship, like you're in school and somebody throws some pennies at you. So you're witness to that. And in this case, you can see my mother's response. My mother does not confront the person who, on the other side of the counter, but she grabs it and comes out the store. And as a child, I'm witnessing this, and I feel, because my mother has always tugged me somewhere, I feel what's happening in her hand. But then, this is the key of the poem. The poem becomes instructional, the same way I'm learning a lesson at this counter, and this is a lesson that you learn outside the school classroom, but are very, very important. And so what happens, that same hand that takes those coins, that same hand that snatches me, now that when we leave the store, that same hand teaches me the importance of empowerment. And so when I say, and it's empowerment, but it's also comforting. So I want to make sure that hand is comforting, but it's guiding me. And it's also saying, okay, what you're seeing this, it may happen to me, but there's no street that you cannot cross. Okay. And what happens is that, this may be happening in my lifetime, but you as my child will one day own the store. That's how the lesson is carried out. Now, once again, I made reference to Maya Angelou in a previous poem. I'm aware of sampling. In this case, I know that I'm drawing heavily upon the poet Lance Jeffers, who has his poem, When I Know the Power of My Black Hand. And back in the 70s, that poem was one that I love to read, and sometimes recite Lance Jeffers at some of my own readings. I just love that poem. But that was something that hand, and if you look at African American literature, hands and feet play a key role in terms of images. Feet in terms of flight, but hand in terms of power. So that's one. The second poem is called Einstein, and this, I think, you see me playing around in terms of moving historical figures around. And there's a certain playfulness in the poem. Einstein. Sometimes I would run into Einstein standing on a corner near 42nd Street. We would talk about the commute from New Jersey to New York. Einstein would listen to me while staring and measuring the lights on Broadway. I thought about once taking him to see a play, but he didn't care for musicals. Einstein believed everything good about theater was relative. He told me words carry an invisible energy. Einstein warned about the metaphor race in MFA programs. He told me to avoid poetry readings where people drop mics like bombs. Which is worse, radiation or racism, I asked. You must think I'm a genius, he chuckled. Yes, I said as he guided me around another black hole without looking. And it's a whole bunch of stuff in there about Einstein and stuff. But, and once again, I would probably say this is another poem comes from June Jordan, one of Miss Valentine's poem, where, she's had this character talking to a woman who's cleaning the steps of the house and asked like, hey, Miss So-so, what do you think about E = mc squared? Which has nothing to do with this woman washing the steps, and then there's this whole thing like, Einstein would be considered a genius, but his socks wouldn't match, things like that. But I wanted to have this sense of intimacy where like, I'm hanging out 42nd Street with Einstein. And I tell you, in my own life, something similar to this happened. I was at the DuPont Circle Metro stop. And people go to work around 8 o'clock, and out jumps Bishop Tutu, and I go up there and say, are you Bishop Tutu? Yes, my brother. And we walk for about a block together. So I guess I could put Einstein in a poem if in my real life I see Bishop Tutu coming out of the red line in DC. I say that in terms of, and this gets back to Miho's work, also, you want to have an element of surprise in your poem. And that might be in terms of the contrast between the two lines, or it might be in the line itself. That before that line
or the pairing ends. In this case. Right. I mean, this pairing in particular made me think about, I've been reading your work for so many years. That this pairing in particular reminds me of, two of your greatest gifts. On one hand, you can write about the greatly serious, and your closers are awesome. You always have powerful closing lines. This poem could be so deceivingly simple, and then you get to the end and boom, knock you upside the head. And then on the other hand, you can write these incredibly humorous poems. And most poets are afraid of trying to write humorous poems. It's fear-inducing. You either write seriously or you're a Billy Collins, of poetry.
Well, but see,
that's your style,
yeah,
right?
But I was influenced by Sterling Brown, who always had, Long as Strong Man and Old Land, but he had poems, about, that were funny. And then he always included humor in between his poem, what he called lies, which really, I came for the lies sometimes.
So what inspires you to write? I mean, what's your process? How is writing a humorous poem different from writing other types of poetry for you?
Well, I think, that's something my children would probably say, "Oh, Dad, you're just being silly. We don't pay you any attention." I mean, that's how I'm seeing, at least, but within my own house, oh, he's just a joke.
Or silly poems. I mean, what advice would you give, to a poet? Is this something you feel that poets should try?
No, I think what happened here, you maybe Miho has this thing. You play with the language, if you don't want to lose that playfulness. No, and I write a lot about baseball. You don't want to lose that love for the game. And it is simply a game. It might be turned into a business, and there's lockouts going on right now. But it's a game. It's a game that, for example, that if you go look at it, you think of your youth, because that's what the games are about. And so what happens is there's a playfulness in there. And if, for example, you no longer want to play with the language, then you do something else. You retire. You hit the mute button. But you want to make sure that is, and that's the thing where if you look at some of these self-help books, that playfulness is also equated with joy. You don't want to have that missing from your life. That sense, okay, Miho could be out bird watching and you see a certain bird, and there's a certain joy that you see in terms of the color of the bird, the flight of the bird, but it's a certain joy. And that's something that you want to make sure you're able to appreciate every day.
I like that. Thank you so much. I think so. If, I might recommend to students, if you're to younger poets or emerging poets, if you're feeling some stuckness, maybe you need to reliven your relationship with the language, whatever language that you're writing in, and writing a humorous poem might be a cure or a remedy for that, to kickstart that love again and bring you back into that relationship with language. Thank you, Ethelbert. Miho, can we hear from you?
Okay. Just continuing this conversation just one more time. I read something interesting recently. It says the beauty is monotonous, and something like humor and lies are infinite.
Ooh. Say it again. Say it one more time.
The beauty. Okay, it's not exactly word by word, but the beauty is monotonous, but the humors and lies are infinite.
Wow.
Something to keep. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to read a poem. I wrote this for a friend of mine. Actually, I collaborate with her. She's a visual artist. So she creates a piece of art for my poem. She did that a few times. And also, I live in South Carolina on the coast. So it really hardly ever snows. But a few years ago, it did. It was really cold. So that's when I wrote this. Unusual weather. When I hear her talk about her heart, a lot of things make sense to me, as if swimming into an aquatic light. Squealing stones pour rain, how it pours, picking up speed through shiny stones. How palm leaves sound in the snow when it turns to ice daggers, slide off the leaves without sound. She sings, if it's the ocean, I'll tear it. Like the waves, she doesn't complete her sentences. My heart is full and my heart is empty. A dagger ripples the question, why envy the little mermaid? A manatee washed up on that cold morning. I draw a map on the sand. The wind picks up and changes the course. A crow flies along the Cross Island Bridge against the traffic over my head. She sings, if it's the ocean, I'll tear it. My heart is full and my heart is empty. I will leave the beginning in the sand.
Thank you. My heart is empty and my heart is full, both this and that. For me, this poem kind of brought that perception I had of your poetry as bringing these opposites together. And in this poem, in a harmonious way, at least for me as a reader, in that, okay, both things are, they're coexisting. So I felt this harmony of opposites. A very
that's a nice way of saying that. How many?
Well, it's a very Zen thing. This it's a very Zen thing. This and that, both. Both. Yes to both. Yes to everything.
But yes, Ethelbert talked about surprises, but in a poetry, surprise means it's a surprise, but it has to be connected, right? If it's just out of nowhere for just unrelated, that's not poetry, really.
Right, but it so much depends on our perception of the time or the lens we have. It can sometimes be a subjective thing, because when I look and, I thought of your work, when I was reading your work, I thought of it a lot as a stream of consciousness, except that there's an associative link. When you have a stream of consciousness flow, right, there's an anchoring something, even if things seem to be opposite, rather than haphazard.
Well, let me ask a question, push back on here for a second in terms of this surprise, Miho, because sometimes I'm thinking about how within a line, someone will place a word because of the sound of it. That when you get to that sound, it's going to be a surprise. It's going to leave a certain taste in your mouth. And so what happens, it may have nothing to do with the meaning of that line, but just like the sound of it. And so I like the fact that sometimes something is in there and people just use it as a surprise, like a boom or something like that. The same way at one time back during the 30s, when people were writing very political work, proletarian literature, you had these exclamation mark, or you had capital letters that you knew that this was good. The surprise was going to be in the middle of the line where the capitalists came in and you fought them off and boom, and that sort of surprise was someone would call back in those days revolutionary. The turning of things upside down. Right. Your poem began one way and then it ended the other way.
So sound can also be an anchoring device, very, very interesting.
But I still think the sound, we try hard to sound good, looking for the words that sound similar or opposite or something, but it cannot be random. That's not the reason to choose a word. I think always have to keep relationship in mind. Yeah.
Well, then I think there's something that we didn't mention in the beginning of this program when we were talking about collaboration. And I said, okay, we did some of these poems quick, but there are poems that we did some revision on. And so what happened, we went back and we looked at things and we made some changes. So sometimes what happens, you could revise the poem and take that surprise out. The surprise was in the initial writing, but now if you're revising the poem, you look up and you might say, okay, yeah, I may not want to keep that because of what it does. It does surprise, it interrupts the thinking. Now that I stand back and look at it and you say, okay, I'm going to take that out. So it is interesting in terms of when you have the surprise, how do you deal with when you're also handling revision?
Absolutely. And I think I like it when I feel that the writer may be as equally surprised as I am, because that can definitely be revised out of a poem. And some people call it, the original energy, the intention is there, but the original energy or spirit of the poem or the fire of the poem, they call it all sorts of things, may actually be revised out of the work. You were going to add to this, to what Ethelbert said, Miho.
I was thinking that when you write the linked poem, you offer your line to the next person and you receive the line, from the previous person. So if one person tries to dominate, that might kill something. But in our case, I do not think I'm not trying to dominate the poem. Neither does Ethelbert. So, but at the same time, we have to say what we think. You know, what do you mean by this? At the end, we can ask. I mean, so you know, we do make edit depending on how it goes. But I think the first one I read our third poem. We made a lot of changes. Right. And it became better because of those changes. But we discussed, I think, quite a lot what we mean by this. What's the effect? Some of the things I did not realize. And
but there were also a thing where you had made a change and we just were thinking differently on that particular line.
That's right.
You saw the word a different way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's very interesting how we negotiate our way. So
negotiate, right.
But that speaks to the friendship and that collaborative bond. You know, I think, you know, we can't always just necessarily collaborate with anyone just based on our art disciplines themselves. There's also some synergy and like that. You know, there's that bond.
Right. I think it comes because we also discuss books. You know, in terms of I was always, for meeting, Miho, I was just impressed by how much she read. You know, it was kind of intimidating. You know, but what I'm saying is that once you are, and you know, when you were at Bennington, where the emphasis is placed on reading and writing, where they used to say we were trying to produce men and women of letters, not necessarily writers. But what happens is that once you're discussing ideas and reading, we're reading a lot of writers by Chilean authors, you sort of say, okay, I know how this person is thinking, I know how this person is reading about this character, or why are they pulling this passage out of a novel to discuss? Once you're having that sort of interaction, then when you sit down to collaborate, it works.
It's hard for me to conceive of like fully evolving as a writer, coming into your own as a writer without reading others. I'm always talking to younger writers and students about this, that, we must read, yeah. Miho, though you read an unusually high amount. Can you tell us? Because I remember when I first heard about this, I was like, yeah, and she's not a librarian, or she's just a writer. How many books do you read a year, so that our audience has an idea?
Well, maybe I am not reading as much as I used to, but for many, many years, I did read about 100 books a year. And I don't know, I might really like reading much better than writing. It's maybe possible. I have to pull myself away. I have to put myself away from reading to write. So
a little easier to read than it is to write over the long term,
we were laughing, but if I'm not mistaken, I think like the quote, the average American reads like 6 books a year. I think it's very low. I mean, the average American is not reading a lot of, especially, and that was before social media and all the other things, that we might say as distraction. But a lot of people are not reading in terms of reading broadly. I mean, in terms of that, or in the case of Miho, reading in more than one language.
Yes.
That's give me a possibility, just that I find the new possibilities, just the opportunity to look at things differently. So I'm very fortunate. Yes. Naomi, you too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it in terms of music, and if you ask the musicians if they listen to music, not just create it, and they told you, well, they only listened to 3 albums in 1 year, you would be like, what? What's wrong with you? So I think about it akin to that, like it forms your world, and it allows you to see all the incredibly infinitesimal creative possibilities within your genre or other disciplines. I think that's the real value of that. Like you said, it just expands your meta view. Miho, can we hear a second
Okay.
poem from you in this round?
Yes, that's the, this was the first collaborative poem I think we did. One of us is missing, for everyone in search of home. I missed the bus and couldn't remember. When did I walk from the shore to the shelter? My hair salty but no longer wet. How will I survive without the others? What did my mother dream when I left her alone? I missed the bus. How long should I wait at this bus stop? I might be waiting for the wrong bus. I must be in the wrong country. I no longer know where I am going. I should sell my shoes for food. I cannot find a map. Inside invisibility begins new possibilities.
Thank you. I have to say that among the collaborative poems, this is my favorite. This is definitely, and it's ironic to know that it was your first. It's just I like how introspective it is, and this, you know, the kinds of things I contemplate on a walkabout in my neighborhood. I really enjoyed this one a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ethelbert.
You want me to comment on that poem, or?
Sure.
Well, you know, the writer Helene Habila, I was thinking of the various migrants crossing the Mediterranean, and you know, where you look up, you're staying at a bus stop. You don't know the language. Somebody says, okay, here's a place that you should go to get, you know, help or what, a shelter or whatever, but you don't know how to get there. And to me, those are the pressing. The whole idea of home is one of the most pressing issues, I think, of our century. You see that in terms of, you know, we have a serious refugee and migrant problem. And so people are always on the move. And this is why I always feel that the people who define our times are people who are Palestinian, you know, in terms of what does a home mean. And so what happens is that that's a thing that becomes very important, because with technology, it's changed us. You know, at one time you say, I'm going to call home. And you knew that it was somebody, you know, with a cord phone, you know, picking it up. Now when you say you're calling home, you know, you don't know where where the person is. They could be in the next room or whatever. But that whole concept of home becomes very, very important. And I think once again, as we begin to pick up our space program, it's going to be very interesting to see whether somebody says, okay, the moon is my home, you know, because, you know, they were born on the moon or whatever, or born in the space station. I mean, that's becoming very, very real. The same way we have many people who have cross-border who are going to be born in shelters, or like you saw in Ukraine, somebody's going to be born in a subway. You know, so you can say, where was your first home? Or between 125th and 126th Street. You know what I mean? I mean, it's going to be concepts like that, you know, and I'm joking, but what happens in terms of the documents where somebody fills out a form, your birth certificate, where were you born? You know, it says hospital. No, it says a subway stop. This particular year, oh, somebody said, oh, that was the war. Okay. Or for example, many people who will have no documents. So there'll be no things of sense of home. And I just addressed this in terms of my own family, in terms of, I always wrote about my father not being able to read his birth certificate because it was in Spanish. And so the sense of home was lost to him in terms of the language was severed. And many times language is what connects you to home. The food, if you start being an immigrant or whatever, and you start eating fast food, then you are cut off from your roots. You know, you call you Mr. McDonald. You know?
Thank you, E. Can we hear more poems from you, Ethelbert?
Yeah, I read a poem that has changed, and you see this in terms of whether it's Ukraine, whether it's people coming across into Texas from Mexico, or coming from Cuba. This whole thing of migrants carrying like a backpack or something like that. But let me show you how the poems begin. It goes from personal to political. So my wife is renovating the basement, and she says, "You have your stuff down there." Stuff. My archives, my books, stuff. So it's like, I'm gonna go down there and protect my stuff. And so this poem is called Stuff. Yet you can see the political implications is much different than just renovating a basement. Stuff. What we will leave behind is stuff. The things that belong to us, what we collected and cherished, the things we love and the things we wanted to preserve, protect, and not discard, is our stuff we carry across borders, the smell of our lost land, the stuff that survived the earthquakes of wars, the genocide of gangs, the fires and floods, the things we carry in our arms and on our heads, the things we bounce with our hope, the things people wanted to kill us for, our stuff, our lives and dreams. We love our stuff, the stuff that matters. Our love-filled stuff, the remains of our hearts. Our star-bright stuff shining through all the stuff that says to our stuff, we must fight and struggle against a suffocating suffering, the stuff of sins that clings to our stuff as we pray over our stuff, the stuff we cannot leave behind.
Yeah.
And that's the first time I've read that poem. But it's just a thing in terms, I'm just amazed at how, and then I guess once again, I forget the author's name, the Vietnam novel, where the soldiers in Vietnam are carrying a certain weight that you have to carry, and all of us carry a certain weight as we move from one career path or one state to another. There's stuff that we carry, and you see that very much because of homelessness. Okay, what happens when people are evicted? What happens to their quote stuff? And I think one of the things I find the most painful is evictions, where people's stuff is just put out into the street. I remember the great photographer Vanderzee, his stuff, his photographs of Harlem, it was just put out in the street, because he couldn't pay his rent. And I think of all the artists, especially, who, because they're paying, they have art jobs and they don't have proper wages and protections and pensions, that all of a sudden what happens, their stuff is put out. Their paintings, their piano is put out in the street, and then it rains, or people, come and take your stuff, and I just feel that is, it is so inane. I just get very angry when I see evictions. And now we saw it, I lived in your neighborhood around Mount Pleasant, Elsmore, but the gentrification was taking off, and the evictions where people were just being pushed, out of the space, and could only take a few things. And that's sad.
Yeah, and it's only, the potential danger, with the end of COVID protections and that happening, it's just
right.
ever on the rise, absolutely. Let's hear another piece from you, Ethelbert.
This is called The Lifeguard. She was listening to Schubert by the sea when she saved me. I had been searching for seashells in haiku, small things that are semi-precious. There are many things men do and fail at doing. Trying to love someone is like swimming. One has to jump in and ignore the waves of despair. I was fortunate a lifeguard was on duty the day I decided to be a writer. She gave me music and called me Franz. That was in another century. And I think once again, I borrowed, there was a Baraka poem. He's talking about Thelonious Monk. He says like Thelonious, that sounds like, you call your child Thelonious, it's not, it ain't 2022, buddy. Thelonious means like, okay, it's 1495 and why are we having this? Am I got to go through this again? When you call somebody Thelonious, and there was like Thelonious Spear Monk. My name is Ethelbert. What's up with that? I should be Thelonious. Anyway, that's the thing about language, and many times it's language and music that saves us,
yes,
in a very serious way. So I'm grateful.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
You're here.
Yeah.
Miho, can we hear 2 more poems from you?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so these 2 are my short story poems. I'll tell you more about it later.
Okay.
Side by side. Shoulders touch when we laugh. It doesn't count while we sit side by side. Parallel words never lie, not the truth. Glance at your hands, animated. Our lifelines refuse to cross, palms down. We sit next to each other. There is no goodbye. The next one is called Once for Once. Your jacket, tobacco smell, such a touch of softness. I thought I saw a message of my swift pulse, flashes, breaths. Light changes. I will let someone else fill it. That night, an umbrella fell from the body's nearness. The grip, the raindrops split the kiss. Blink at midday and know, once for once, I won't link you to what I will miss. Thank you.
Stories?
Well, short story poems. I do not write stories, but as you know, I read a lot of stories, or it could be movies. But there is a scene that it just leaves so much impression on you. So like somebody was sitting side by side, a couple eating, facing each other, eating. And sitting side by side, I felt, oh, that's something very different. Or like, the movie Lost in Translation, Bill Murray is sitting at the bar always, and people are looking straight forward and still carrying on conversation. Something like that. I wanted to write a story about sitting, a couple or friends or strangers.
Oh, I think we've lost you for a minute there.
Froze for a second.
Oh no.
It might come back.
Let's give her a moment to.
Okay. There it goes.
Oh, here you are. We lost you for a moment.
Oh, okay. Okay. Where did you lose me?
Lost in Translation, Bill Murray.
Okay.
Sitting.
Right. So they were sitting side by side, and that's what I said. I was thinking the people sitting side by side seems to have a different relationship from the people who are sitting, face to face, or the relationship changes depending on how you sit, between yourself. So I wanted to really write a short story about that, but I couldn't, so I wrote a poem.
Thank you. Yeah, so, and now that you bring it up, I see how these are different from others and that they move more. There's still that unusual, element of these precise details that rise to the surface in your work. But I can see how, they paint a portrait. Very, very special about these two in particular. Thank you. And anything you want to say, anything else you want to say about these in particular, Miho? About this?
The second one, once for once, there is a Japanese saying, you meet only once in your lifetime, ichigo ichie. So that's it's like a philosophy in, say, tea ceremony or in anything. Maybe it is from Zen aesthetics, but you meet someone. So I meet you, Naomi, for the first time, and I might meet you again, but each time is the only time in a lifetime to meet here now. So that's the translation that I made from that word. So once for once. Yes,
that's beautiful. I do believe that we're always meeting once, just once. Never can you replicate a moment. And I think both of you have this gift as poets of capturing those moments, taking a moment and upholding the moment in time. And I think of being alive as that kind of experience. If we can be present with this one moment that we have, and then we may have another one, but now it's just this moment. Just this moment. Anything you want to add to this, Ethelbert?
No, I just felt that, this is a way in terms of, music, you don't play something the same way in terms of a jazz musician or any musician, it's completely different. And that's how you need to approach. If you go into a museum, and you go to a museum regularly, but every time you look at a painting, it should be looking at it with new eyes and experiencing that. And that's something that I think many times we have to learn how to do that, to be in that moment and appreciate it. I think this is where, I write a lot about baseball, but this is why I don't want to have people speed up the game. I think there's a point where you want to have, especially art, you want to come and have that time to for that particular moment. It's all that matters, and that's something that, changes who we are, changes our behavior, changes how we treat each other. And it slows us down in a very good way. Our society for the last 30, 40, 50 years has been caught up with speed, and getting through that. And there's a certain aggression that goes with that. And you miss a lot of things if you're speeding by. You see the landscape a certain way. And sometimes you look up at what makes us human, that moment where, we just go out and feel that sun on our skin, or Miho likes to swim. You miss that. If you're thinking about the shore or getting out of the pool all the time, then you're not appreciating swimming. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If you go out every night and you just look for the moon, then you don't know where the stars are.
That's the truth, Rufus. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for adding that. More poems from you, Ethelbert?
Okay, I think that coming to our last set. This is a poem. I write a lot about my father and my mother, and I think it's a lot because I'm getting older and I'm looking at how they aged and how I'm in that 70 period of my life. And this is things my father told me. Long before terms like role model and conferences about the Black family and Black masculinity and why so many Black men are incarcerated, my father turned down the volume of the television and casually told me how he could leave my mother, how he could be like other men who walked out the door and never came back. I was too young to understand what he was saying because he was speaking to the future in me. My father always kept his hat by the door. There were nights when I could not sleep, when I walked from the back of the house to the front door, when I went looking to see if my father's hat was still sleeping, that it had not found its shirt, pants, shoes, or coat. I once held my father's hat in my hand like a crown I could not wear. My age, undeserving of his weight and not understanding the beauty of his pain. And that's just, the poem goes from the abstract, I spent 40 years at Howard University, and I think every aspect of the Black experience was always thrown at me from some degree. And what happens is that, I realized that when we talk about Black labor and work and stuff, that I never worked as hard as a day in a lot one day as my father did, and it's actual labor when you come home and you're tired or you're exhausted. And at the same time, you're struggling to keep a roof over the head of your family, and now that I have all the documents, I have a better understanding. See, back then there was no like take your son to work, right? So growing up in the South Bronx, this is what I heard. But your father works at Central, right? Okay, okay. So I mean, all through elementary school, junior high school, where did your father work? Central. I don't even know what Central is, okay? Central had to be like Central Station, like down, like that was where he worked in the post office that was at Central Station down in Midtown Manhattan. But everybody, like African Americans, shorten it, Or what happens, you would say things like, "Oh, where do you work? I work at the Mayflower." You don't even say hotel, you just say the Mayflower, like it's a boat. You know what I'm saying? And so what happened, this poem, it's for all the babies in the family who wake up and sneak around and look what's going on. And so in this case, you know, when I sneak out of my room, my father's hat is not just a hat, okay? It represents something that sometimes, you know, you don't touch that. You do not touch. Sometimes people come in, that hat's place, you do not touch that. Now, maybe like in these sort of, you know, medieval movies where the crown is passed somewhere, so you'll reach a level and your father will call you in the room and yes, Gene, come here, try this hat on. And by that time, the father puts your hat on your head. There is no way you wear that out in the South Bronx because somebody will kick you in your butt just for wearing a stupid little hat get on your head. You know, I remember when I went to Howard and my first year, I walked around downtown DC with a little Howard beanie, with a little H. You know, and that was a thing where you knew there was no way I would wear that to Southeast these days. Like, and look, I got a little H, and that would be good. You know, where are you from? Heaven or hell, brother? We're gonna send you whichever way you want to go. But you know, but what happened on a serious note, that hat by the door is almost like my father paying the rent on a regular basis. If that hat disappears, okay, like in some other household, that man is gone. The hat is gone. And so every day when you see that hat there, you can go back to your room and sleep, knowing that the next day you've got a roof over your head because your father provided for that roof over your head. And you don't forget that. See? And then I realized, getting back to the funny hats, I knew that when my father called me into the room, which he did, and tried on a hat, it was with pride that he was wanting to pass something on to me. And I took the hat. See, I didn't wear it, but there was no way I was going to turn down because it was a gift to me. And he was recognizing that, okay, you know, I'm only here for a short amount of time. And this is a hat that I wore and didn't want you to touch when you were younger, but I'm giving it to you. And in every household, Miho probably the same story. In fact, Miho, I think I asked you this question when you lost a loved one. Was there anything that you were bringing back that belonged to, like, say, your mother, something physical?
Yes. I brought a letter box, among other things, but it's in a way, it's not something you choose. It's just something presented, even though it's not that my mother said, you know, this is yours or anything, but yes. Yes. Okay.
Let's hear a second piece from you, Ethelbert.
Okay, you know, every poet has like, you know, signature poems, you know, and I learned that from going to readings by Sterling Brown. He would always end his poetry readings. At one time, at least when I met him, he would end his poetry reading with reading of Strong Men, and that became a signature poem. Politicians like Marion Barrett, you know, liked that poem because it was uplifting, empowering. But before I met Sterling Brown, I guess when he must have been reading like in the early 60s, he would end with this poem, Olem, which is a much stronger poem of resistance and much more political. So I found it was interesting that here was a person who had a signature poem, but it had changed. At one time, I would end my reading with a poem called Divine Love. But now what I find ending my readings with is this poem called Black Men Are Precious. And, you know, yesterday was the tribute for Ski Muhammad, who was at WPFW for many years. Greg Tate passed away. I mean, there's been so many people. Stanley Cry, I guess go down the list. And this poem is called Black Men Are Precious. Black men, Black friends having strokes. Black men younger than me. Good men with bad hearts. Men who did not follow their fathers into factories or the post office. Black men who went off to college and pulled themselves up by degrees. Men who did not sink into despair, but lifted their families into new homes. Black men who survived the bullets, streets, and police. Black men who saw the horizons and the stars. They marched as if Garvey held out his hand, not to Ethiopia, but to our hearts. Black hearts, now failing for unknown reasons. Why? Why do we die so young? Why are we not like our grandfathers sitting on the porch rocking away the years? Why are we not the Black men returning from the wars and lifting our girlfriends up into wives again? Why do we date this early death? After all the exercise and pills, after the changing diet, why is there such a cruel hunger that appears and takes our years? Black men, my friends, resting in their open coffins, waiting for someone to sing, precious Lord, take their hand. Black hands closing with so much love still left to give.
Thank you, Ian. That's stunning. That's a fabulous closing poem.
Thank you.
Miho, can we hear your final two poems?
I read my final poems, right?
Oh,
I started.
you did. I am so sorry. I've gotten into it. Like, we need to start wrapping up, but I'm caught in the spell of the both of you together. So actually, let me ask you both a closing question. I think that the idea of collaborating with another poet is something that all of us should try at least once during the course of our development as writers. And I'm wondering what advice you would give to other poets to begin a collaboration, how to approach it. I mean, we all have many friends, and I have many friends who write, and it has never come naturally to me to think of collaborating on a piece. I've collaborated with them in other ways, but never on a piece of writing. What advice would you give other poets to try this, and why? What have you gotten out of it personally?
Well, Miho, you go first. I'll follow you.
Okay. So I have a friend. We write collaboratively. How this started was he read one of my poems, and he wrote another poem, kind of answering to my poem. So my poem was already in my first book, and he published that in his first book. So that's how we got started writing together. So we go one poem, one poem. I think there are so many ways to collaborate. We do one line by line sometimes, or stanza by stanza, or you could write the whole poem. And there is a little game like linked poem. It's called the Rengay, RENGAY. You can look it up, but this one, and with an example, you can see how it goes. 2 people, 3 people can get together and start writing together. There are certain rules to it. So it's easier when you have rules. If it's just open field, you feel at loss, you don't know what to do. But if you begin with something with specific rules, but not something tight, and you don't have to stick to them, that might help you get started, I think.
Oh, thank you. That's an excellent suggestion.
Yeah, I think the collaboration, there's different types. I think, for example, many times when people collaborate, they're in the same space, and that's important. You're sitting, Miho was talking about eating and face to face and side by side. I think many times when you're collaborating, sometimes you're in the same space, studio space, cafe space. And so you're looking over someone's shoulder, you're crossing things out. And that's a different type of collaboration, sometimes, you're in a band and you're collaborating, and you're like Billy Strayhorn and Duke Ellington, they're not using email, they're standing over and that's a very important in terms of physical collaboration, because you're in the same space. One of the things I find that Miho and I have not done, we have not say screen share, like type of thing, But the other thing I think in terms of collaboration, which is if I was mentioning advice to other people, I think you want to collaborate with somebody who gives you a different sound, whose work is that challenges you, that opens up a new range to your ear or new way of seeing. And in this case, what happens, Miho laugh at me like, okay, so I started learning a little Japanese, I guess at least, but what happened? If we're not collaborating, on these phones, I won't even think about, the fact that, well, be collaborating, at least be able to say hello to her or good night or whatever, because what happens is that the collaboration is very important in terms of the first level of respect. for the other artists, respect for what they're doing, respect for their discipline. And so now what happens, you're talking about, okay, how do I now begin to share? Okay, and sharing is a spiritual gesture and level of attainment. You don't share immediately. You have to reach a point of sharing, and then with that comes a sense of trust. Okay, they will reach a point, for example, where me will say, okay, I was thinking of the same word or something like that. Then you know intuitively that you're on the same page. Okay, the same way if you look at I always use it, Free Jazz Out with Ornette Coleman, where a group of guys just go into a studio. They don't even know what they're gonna play. But after a while, they learn to follow each other. So it's very interesting. If you look at the 3 poems, I think probably Miho and I got off to a really good start. Okay, because you can see, you know, we're not straining to you know, the next poem. I don't know when we're gonna do the next one, but I think there was an immediate way where it worked. Okay, and this is where in sports, all of a sudden, like in football, a quarterback knows, okay, this receiver knows where to cut, and the ball's gonna be right there. Okay, because they're on the same page. And after a while, you see guys who they play in college. We saw them in Cincinnati Bengals. They play in college. Oh, we've been fooling around when we were kids, so I know where you're gonna throw the ball. So you know what I mean, that's where you get to that, and the collaboration results in a love for the game and love for literature. And you realize, okay, we're doing something in terms of bringing 2 different cultures together, you know, age together, gender, all these things are coming together. In a world where everything seems to be falling apart, this type of collaboration, okay, becomes a symbol of not just poetry, it's something much more.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Well said.
That element, you know, I hadn't considered that, you know, besides the bond, is that trust that somebody has your back and you have each other's back. And so you're freer in a sense to play and be about. It's sort of like, you know, the equivalent of what you were talking about, Miho, of having guidelines, not to imprison you, but to give you the contained freedom to explore and play. And not have it be, to have your possibilities reduced till you feel free and safe to play. That's beautiful. Thank you. Before we close, I wanted to extend an invitation to our viewers to catch the opening for our current exhibit, the work by the incredibly talented Dominique Hughes. Come join us on March 19th from 4 to 6 and take part in an exhibit opening reception with us. And we're going to close by having you guys take us out with haiku in Japanese and English. So back to you guys.
Okay, I'm going to read the Japanese and Miho will read the English.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Now that I like, go ahead.
Okay, so this is
I want a haiku in Spanish by Monday morning.
Thanks, teacher. But this is a haiku that Miho selected. I'll read it in English and she'll read the Japanese. The first spring gust, blowing 1,000 kisses. Will you catch it?
1000回のキスをあなたに春一番。
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. So I appreciate you honoring us with your poetry and your thoughts and your reflections. Really appreciate you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for giving us the opportunity to do this together.
Thank you very much.
Have a great Sunday.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.